Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here today to reflect on an aspect of life that can weigh heavily on the heart, our relationships. Whether it is with a family member, a friend, or a romantic partner, sometimes we find ourselves giving everything we have, but despite our best efforts, the relationship does not bear fruit. There are moments in life when we must listen, not just to our emotions, but to a deeper call. Today, I want to explore with you the idea that there are times when God is telling us to let go, to release, and to move forward for our own well-being. Let us talk about 6 signs, clear markers, that God may be urging us to give up on someone. Because even though we want to keep trying, there are moments when our love is not the answer. In these moments, our path forward lies in trusting God's wisdom to guide us, knowing when to stay and when to step back. When the relationship drains your peace, there is a stillness that comes with being in right relationships, a peace that anchors the soul and steadies the heart. It's not just the absence of conflict, but a deep sense of calm that flows from knowing you are where you are meant to be, loving who you are meant to love. But peace is a fragile gift, one that can be easily stolen when a relationship no longer serves the purpose it was meant to. And we all know what it feels like to be emotionally drained. It's that exhaustion you can't quite explain. It doesn't come from hard physical labor, but from the strain of trying to maintain a connection that seems to take everything out of you. When you wake up each morning and the first thought that greets you is of this person, whether it's worry, frustration, or dread, that is a sign something isn't right. Peace is not just a nice to have. It is essential to our well-being, a sign that we are living in alignment with God's will. But when we find ourselves dreading every encounter with someone we care about, when the thought of them fills us with anxiety or frustration instead of joy, it's time to pay attention. It's not just a bad day or a rough patch. It's a pattern. Our peace should not come at the cost of sacrificing our soul. If the relationship consistently drains your peace, you are not in a healthy dynamic, and it's possible that God is nudging you to let go. It's easy to dismiss feelings of anxiety or exhaustion as temporary or personal shortcomings. You might convince yourself that you're simply overreacting or that you need to try harder. But listen, God does not call us to live in a constant state of stress or emotional depletion. When He tells us in His Word that He is the God of peace, it's not just a beautiful phrase, it's a promise. When peace is consistently absent from your life because of a relationship, it may be God's way of showing you that your peace matters, that it is time to step away. Consider a situation like Rachel's. She had a close friendship for many years, a friendship that once felt like a safe harbor. But in recent months, Rachel noticed that every time she spoke with her friend, she walked away feeling drained. It wasn't just the emotional weight. Her mind was cluttered with worry, her sleep disturbed by thoughts of her friend's struggles. Despite her best efforts to offer support, she found herself sinking deeper into a state of unease. The joy and peace she once had seemed to fade, and no matter how hard she tried, she could not get back to a place of contentment. It was when she realized that her peace was gone, replaced by a constant undercurrent of worry, that she turned to prayer. It became clear to her that this relationship, in its current form, was not serving either of them. Rachel's heart ached to acknowledge this. But deep down, she knew that holding on only brought both of them further from the peace God had intended. She had to make the difficult decision to step away, not out of spite or anger, but to honor the peace that God desired for her life. That inner turmoil you feel may not always be obvious. It might not come in the form of constant shouting matches or conflict. Sometimes it comes quietly, like a fog that slowly seeps into your soul. It's the weight that pulls you under when you're simply trying to breathe. When we constantly battle inner unrest and turmoil, it is a sign that we are not living in alignment with God's calling for our hearts. When efforts are met with rejection and resistance, love and relationships are built on mutual exchange. There is give and take, a back and forth, where both individuals contribute, listen, and work toward understanding. At times, relationships require patience and perseverance, but there comes a point when all the effort you pour into someone is met with resistance, indifference, or rejection. The more you give, the further away they seem. Your willingness to help, to love, or to support is met not with gratitude but with rejection. This is one of the hardest truths to face. Sometimes, despite all our love and efforts, the person we care for simply isn't in a place where they can receive it. It is one of the most painful realizations, feeling as if all your good intentions are falling on deaf ears, that all your acts of kindness are being pushed aside. We might fool ourselves into thinking that one more conversation, one more gesture of love, or one more prayer will change things. But over time, if the pattern persists, we must face the truth. Our efforts are no longer effective. When someone consistently rejects our attempts to help or love them, it becomes apparent that we are not fighting the same fight. God is not calling us to remain in unhealthy patterns of giving and receiving that drain us. We must learn to recognize when we are no longer invited to participate in the work of love for the other person's growth. Take, for example, Mark, who had been deeply invested in helping a family member struggling with addiction. He attended support meetings with them, stayed up late into the night talking about recovery, and offered practical assistance in every way he could. Yet despite his devotion, his efforts were met with resistance. Resistance not just from the behavior, but from the attitude of this person, who was not willing to engage in the healing process. His offers were brushed off, and each conversation left him feeling as though he was talking to a wall. Mark was emotionally and physically exhausted. He prayed for clarity, but for a long time, he held on to the hope that somehow his constant efforts would bring change. It wasn't until he began to notice that his health was beginning to suffer and that his mind was consumed with thoughts of this family member that the truth became undeniable. God was showing him that he was not meant to carry this burden alone. Mark finally had the courage to take a step back, trusting that God would work in the life of his loved one in ways that Mark simply could not. Rejection can come in many forms, not just from the words spoken, but also from the actions that follow. Rejection can be silent, subtle, or passive-aggressive, but it always sends the same message. The person is not yet ready to receive what you are offering. While this may be painful, it is important to remember that God's work in someone's heart is not always something we can control. Sometimes our best action is not to force the door open, but to trust that God will open it in His timing. When our help is met with resistance, we must release our desire to change things and allow God to work in ways we cannot. Our values define us. They shape the way we make decisions, the way we treat others, and how we view the world around us. They are the framework through which we interact with life. As believers, our values are rooted in the truth of who God is and the calling He places on our hearts. They are a reflection of His character, truth, love, integrity, and justice. But there are times when a relationship challenges us to the point where we must question whether we are compromising the very values we hold dear. A relationship should bring out the best in us, encouraging us to grow in righteousness and integrity. But when we find ourselves in situations where we are constantly bending or abandoning our beliefs to maintain peace or avoid conflict, it's a sign that something is wrong. We might justify these compromises, telling ourselves that it's just for now, that it's necessary to avoid a confrontation, or that we can always fix things later. But each small concession chips away at the very core of who we are. Soon, we can no longer recognize the person looking back at us in the mirror. If you find yourself in a relationship where you are continually asked to compromise your values, it's important to ask yourself, is this still a relationship that God has called me to? If the answer is no, then it may be time to step away and seek healing, trusting that God will restore your integrity. The Creator of individuality and the angels of good make it heaven. Consider the story of Natalie, who found herself in a relationship where the boundaries between right and wrong became increasingly blurred. At first it was small things, lying to others to cover for her partner, downplaying behaviors that went against her moral compass. But as time passed, these compromises grew larger. Her conscience began to nag at her, yet she ignored it, telling herself it was just easier to go along with things. But deep down, she could feel her values slipping away like sand between her fingers. One evening, after an especially difficult argument, Natalie realized she was no longer the person she had been when the relationship began. She could no longer deny that the things she had compromised for the sake of this relationship had eroded her sense of self. God's voice was quiet, but it was unmistakable. The quiet nudge in her heart was clear. She needed to let go of this relationship. It was a painful realization, but as she began to step back, she could feel the weight lifting from her shoulders. Over time, she rediscovered the woman she was before, strong in her convictions, living with integrity, and in that space, she was able to heal and grow into the person God had always called her to be. If a relationship forces you to choose between what is right and your desire to keep the peace, it is no longer serving the higher purpose for which God created you. He does not want you to be in situations where you continually compromise your values. When God is calling you away from someone, it may very well be because He wants to restore your commitment to truth and righteousness and to protect you from being shaped into someone you were never meant to be. When your health, mental and physical, begins to decline, we often think of relationships as emotional exchanges, but they affect us in every part of our being. Emotionally, mentally and physically, the stress, anxiety, and turmoil that arise from unhealthy or toxic relationships can manifest in our bodies in ways we may not immediately recognize. But when the weight of a relationship begins to affect your physical and mental health, it is a powerful sign that God is calling you to reevaluate your involvement in it. Our bodies are temples, and the way we care for them reflects how we honor God. Emotional stress, particularly the kind that comes from prolonged negative relationships, can result in headaches, stomach issues, sleep disturbances, and a myriad of other physical ailments. But it doesn't stop there. Mentally, we can become overwhelmed by the constant emotional exhaustion, leaving us feeling anxious, depressed, and emotionally depleted. Over time, these effects take a toll, not just on our well-being, but also on our ability to function effectively in other areas of our lives. It is easy to overlook these signs because we're so focused on the other person and their needs. We convince ourselves that if we just try a little harder, if we just give a little more, the situation will improve. But we fail to see that while we are giving, we are losing pieces of ourselves. Our mental health, physical health, and spiritual health cannot be sacrificed for the sake of maintaining a relationship that is not meant to be. If we fail to put it this way, it also may not be. Think of James, who had been in a deeply codependent relationship for years. At first, he didn't notice the impact on his health. He came on slowly. He was constantly worried about his partner's well-being, managing crises that seemed to never end. James felt a constant tension in his shoulders, as though he was carrying an invisible weight. His sleep became erratic, and his energy drained. But it wasn't until he experienced severe anxiety attacks that he realized how deeply this relationship had affected him. His body had been sending signals for a long time, but he had been too focused on the other person to listen. It took James a long time to admit to himself that the relationship was unhealthy. It wasn't that he didn't care about his partner, but he had reached the point where his mental and physical health could no longer withstand the strain. In prayer, James asked for the courage to let go, to step away from the relationship so that he could begin healing. It was one of the hardest decisions of his life, but as he distanced himself, he began to feel the weight lift from his shoulders. Slowly, his health improved. His mind began to quiet, and with time, he was able to rebuild the strength he had lost. God does not want us to live in constant stress or anxiety. Our bodies and minds are sacred, and they reflect the inner peace God desires for us. If a relationship is draining you in ways that affect your mental and physical well-being, it is not in alignment with the abundant life God intends for you. You do not have to keep sacrificing yourself for someone else. If stepping away is what's necessary for your health, trust that God will give you the strength to do so, and He will provide the healing that you need. When you feel a persistent sense of urgency to move forward, there are moments in life when we are gripped by an unsettling feeling, one that is hard to define but undeniable in its presence. It's a quiet urgency, a persistent nudge within our hearts, as though we are being led to step forward into something new, something different. It isn't a loud, dramatic voice, but rather a gentle but constant whisper, urging us to move ahead, to let go of what has been and embrace what is to come. When this sense of urgency begins to fill your spirit regarding a relationship, it's time to listen. Because God may be signaling that your season with this person has come to an end. This inner sense of needing to move forward can sometimes be mistaken for restlessness or impatience, but in truth, it is often God's call to growth. He never intends for us to remain stagnant. He suggests He rejects an unconditional willingness to be grown and stagnant. When we feel an increasing pull to leave behind what is familiar, it can feel terrifying, as if we are stepping into an unknown future. But we must remember that God never asks us to walk alone into that future. He walks with us, providing the wisdom and strength we need to take the next step. For Sarah, this sense of urgency came after years of trying to hold a failing relationship together. Epistle 2, namely, she had been in a romantic relationship for over 5 years, one that had once brought her joy, but had since become filled with conflict, emotional neglect, and disappointment. For months, she prayed, hoping for change, believing that things would get better. But despite her best efforts, the relationship showed no signs of improvement. Over time, Sarah began to feel a growing sense that she needed to move on, but she couldn't understand why. The feeling wasn't loud, but it was there every day, like a soft voice in the back of her mind telling her, "You were meant for more." At first, Sarah tried to ignore the feeling. She told herself it was just fear of change, or perhaps impatience. But as time went on, the sense of urgency grew stronger. Every moment she spent in the relationship felt heavier. Finally, after a season of prayer and reflection, Sarah realized that this urgent feeling was God's way of leading her to let go. The relationship was no longer serving either of them, and while it was painful to acknowledge, Sarah understood that holding on was only holding her back from the life God had prepared for her. She trusted that this nudge, this quiet urgency, was God's way of guiding her to a new chapter, a chapter that would allow her to heal, grow, and ultimately live in greater alignment with His purpose for her life. When this sense of urgency arises, it is not a sign of weakness or a lack of faith. Rather, it is a divine invitation to trust God's plan for your future. We are not meant to stay stuck in unhealthy patterns, clinging to the past. God's voice is often found in the stillness of these urgencies, and if we listen, we can follow him into new beginnings that bring freedom, peace, and healing. When you notice you are no longer the person you used to be, one of the most profound signs that it may be time to let go of a relationship is the recognition that you have changed, and not in ways that reflect growth or spiritual maturity. You may find yourself becoming someone you don't recognize, someone whose values, attitudes, and behavior have shifted in unhealthy ways. When you begin to feel disconnected from the person you once were, it's crucial to examine the relationships in your life and assess whether they are contributing to your transformation in a positive or negative way. We are called to grow into the fullness of who God created us to be, to become more like Christ in our thoughts, words, and actions. But there are relationships that, over time, pull us away from this calling. They chip away at our character, erode our confidence, and distort our identity. When we are constantly in an environment that is toxic, manipulative, or emotionally draining, we begin to lose sight of who we are in Christ. The person we were created to be becomes obscured, replaced by fear, bitterness, or resentment. It's easy to blame ourselves or chalk it up to external pressures, but the truth is, the relationships we allow to shape us can have a profound impact on our growth, either nurturing it or hindering it. Take the example of Jason, who had been in a close friendship for many years. At first, it had been a source of encouragement, laughter, and joy. But over time, Jason began to feel increasingly bitter and cynical. His friends' constant negativity began to wear on him, and Jason found himself becoming more pessimistic, less hopeful. The kindness he once showed to others slowly diminished, replaced by a sense of guardedness and distrust. He no longer recognized the open-hearted, optimistic person he used to be. It was only after a long period of soul-searching that Jason realized his friendship had shifted from a place of mutual love and encouragement to one of unhealthy dependence and negativity. His friends' constant criticisms and toxic mindset had begun to infiltrate his own heart, transforming him into someone he didn't like. He wasn't just feeling drained anymore. He was becoming someone he didn't want to be. Jason prayed for guidance and insight, asking God to show him whether it was time to step away from the friendship. He sensed God's voice gently but clearly telling him that this relationship was no longer serving his growth. He needed to walk away, not out of anger, but out of a desire to protect the person God had called him to be. This realization is deeply painful because it means acknowledging that the relationship, which once held meaning, has now become a hindrance to spiritual, emotional, and personal growth. Letting go of a relationship that changes you in negative ways is not about blame or resentment. It is about recognizing that you have to protect your own heart. God calls us to be transformed into the image of His Son, not to be reshaped into something lesser or distorted by unhealthy relationships. If you find that you are no longer the person you used to be, ask yourself if this relationship is the cause. Are you becoming bitter, angry, or disillusioned in ways that reflect a departure from your values? Are you distancing yourself from God and others? A difference, a recovery between a hero and a villain? Or should you be trying to turn back the problem from your values? Are you distancing yourself from God and others? These changes, no matter how small, are indicators that you may be in a relationship that is not aligned with God's purpose for you. Sometimes stepping away is the only way to reclaim your true self and allow God to restore what has been lost. As we reflect on these signs, it's important to remember that God is always guiding us, even when it's difficult to see the way forward. The relationships we hold are meant to shape us, to help us grow into the people He has called us to be. But when a relationship consistently drains our peace, challenges our values, or damages our well-being, God's voice often comes in the form of quiet nudges, urging us to step away and let go. The call to move forward is not a sign of failure, but a sign of faith. Faith in God's plan for us, in His desire to see us whole, restored, and living in freedom. Letting go is not easy. It brings pain, loss, and sometimes the fear of the unknown. But we can trust that God's plan is always better than our own, and His love for us is deeper than any attachment we may feel. Just as a gardener prunes the vine to allow new growth, God may be calling us to step away from certain relationships to allow space for healing and growth. So if you find yourself facing these signs, know that you are not alone. God is with you, leading you and supporting you as you make the difficult decision to release what no longer serves you. Trust that this act of surrender will lead to restoration, peace, and a deeper understanding of His love and purpose for your life. Let go and make room for God to do His transformative work in your heart.